The thriller genre can be a difficult thing to define and actually pin down, often overlapping with things like murder mysteries, crime novels, and even horror, to the point of being synonymous in some cases. So when talking about thrillers, I've done my best to avoid cozy murder mysteries and any horror novels that are supernatural, so no ghosts, no monsters, no vampires, but anything that thrills you is a thriller. You're also not going to find any of those books with girl in their title, Gone Girl, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, The Girl on the Train, because we've all read those or seen David Fincher's admittedly excellent film adaptations. Here are 10 thrillers that I think are worth your time. First up, a thriller that overlaps with the horror genre, The Cabin at the End of the World by Paul Tremblay. While this is categorized as a horror novel, it has all of the trappings of a thriller. And it's also arguably gothic, at least in its setting. This is a book about a gay couple and their adopted daughter. They are hanging out and leisurely spending some time in a cabin out in the Massachusetts countryside when a strange man appears. He comes up to the daughter who's playing outside and he says to her, "Your daddies need to let me inside. I have 3 friends coming, they'll be here soon, and we all need to get into the cabin. The 4 of us, along with you and your dads, are gonna help save the world." And eventually, they do get into the cabin, and they tie the family up. And where it goes from there is both bonkers and terrifying. But it's not out and out horrifying. There are no jump scares. This is much more thriller than it is horror. You're constantly wondering what these people want, what they're doing, whether or not they're telling the truth, how in danger our protagonists really are. This is a really chilling kind of home invasion thriller story, and I can't recommend it enough. It is one of my favorite American novels of the past few years. While I did say that I wasn't going to include any cozy murder mysteries, and the first name that jumps to mind is obviously Agatha Christie, she can surprise you. And she does have a few novels that are more thriller than they are murder mystery. A great example is The ABC Murders, which is a Poirot story, where he is tasked with tracking down a serial killer who is taunting him. But I wanted to focus on Endless Night, because this is a standalone novel. This is not a Poirot or Miss Marple story. It's intensely gothic. It's about a young man who meets a young American woman in a small village in England, and the young man ends up falling in love with her and buying and trying to renovate a local house that is apparently cursed. You're constantly on tenterhooks, knowing that bad things are going to happen. The locals do not trust this house. Death seems to follow it, and even surround it on the streets nearby. And the young woman has a lot of secrets. And as you're getting paranoid and wondering who you can trust and what exactly is behind this concept of the house being cursed, you start to wonder, well, is the young man hiding things as well? Who do we trust here? What is going to happen? What is wrong with this house? What is wrong with these people? There's nothing supernatural here. This is an Agatha Christie story. So trying to figure out what's real and what's really happening sets your teeth on edge and has your hair standing up. Compared to all of the cozy murder mysteries she's known for, Endless Night is a real thriller. Another novel by an American author who's generally known for horror is The Final Girl Support Group by Grady Hendrix. This is a novel that leans on the tropes and the subgenre of the final girl slasher thing. When I read this, I was not surprised by the fact that it's a wonderful homage to slasher films, but I was also very surprised by the fact that it's far more a slasher than it is a horror novel. We begin with what the title says, a support group for final girls, girls who have all survived the killing sprees of psychopaths and serial killers. One day, one of them doesn't turn up, and she's been killed. Our protagonist is an odd one out in this group. She survived differently from the rest of them, and she's also easily the most paranoid. And she takes it upon herself to do some detective work and figure out who killed the one that didn't turn up, who is after these girls, and also who the new killer is, because a new final girl has just materialized, which in a metatextual kind of way is talking about how the thriller genre has had a renaissance recently. It's a really fun mystery thriller from a horror author who has proven himself very, very adept at twisting the genres of thriller and horror in really fun ways. The Last House on Needless Street is perhaps my favourite thriller ever. It's a book I've talked about a lot. I love what Katrina Ward does. Her novels are incredible. And this one remains maybe her best and certainly her most famous and celebrated. Although I do think Looking Glass Sound really gives this book a run for its money. If you haven't read Looking Glass Sound, you need to. But The Last House on Needless Street is where I started reading her, and it is a perfect blend of thriller, gothic, and horror. Our main protagonist is a very isolated and lonely man called Ted. He lives in a house on Needless Street, and about 10 years ago, he was a key suspect in the disappearance and potential murder of a girl by the local lake who disappeared. Ted now lives in a house with boarded up windows. He has a daughter that he sees sometimes, and we see the world from her eyes as well. And he also has a cat, and we also get to see the world through the cat's eyes, which is at first really, really strange. Ted's world is claustrophobic and kind of frightening. It sets you on edge, it makes you feel uneasy. As does Ted himself, and he's our protagonist. But he's not the only one, as I said. We also get to know this tiny world from his daughter's perspective and his cat's, and a fourth character who comes in a little bit later. The Last House on Needless Street is an amazing feat of thriller fiction. An incredible crime novel, an incredible gothic pseudo-horror thing. It blends so many genres together so artfully. I love this book. I've talked about it in way more detail in articles and videos, and you can go check those out, but Katrina Ward is something really special, and this is my favourite thriller. The Maidens by Alex Michaelides is a curious novel. Not only does it blend the murder mystery, crime, thriller things all up together, but it's also kind of a piece of dark academia due heavily to its setting. This is a novel set in Cambridge, specifically at Cambridge University. I used to live in Cambridge, so it was really nice reading that setting. Our protagonist is a psychiatrist who went to Cambridge. Her niece is currently studying there, and there has been a murder. Someone close to her niece has died. And it turns out that the girl who died was part of a group called the Maidens, who are very reminiscent of the strange social groups found in things like The Secret History, Bunny, and even If We Were Villains, which is also what makes this very dark academia. What's also fun about this novel is we have a prime suspect who, as the book goes on, his guilt becomes clearer and clearer, and he's a professor at Cambridge. As you go on reading it, you think there is no way in hell this guy didn't do it, and that is really tantalizing because suddenly you feel like you're in some kind of cat and mouse game. He's guilty, we are following our protagonist as she tries to prove it. But is he guilty? I mean, surely he is, but is he? This isn't the most complex novel in the world, it's a pretty simple read, but I enjoyed it. When it comes to thrillers, a lot of us are guilty for focusing on American and British writers, but one of the most harrowing and gritty and gnarly thriller novels you'll ever read comes from Japan, and that is Out by Natsuo Kirino. This was translated from the Japanese by Stephen Snyder, probably my favourite translator from Japanese, and Natsuo Kirino is incredible. This is one of my favourite Japanese novels, but it is dark and it is bleak, so do not go in lightly. This is a thriller through and through. We begin with a really bleak setting. Our protagonists are a group of 4 women who all work at a factory where they box up bento lunches for people to buy from convenience stores and have for their lunch while they go off to the office. These 4 women all have horrible lives. Some of them have kids, some of them don't, but they're all in relationships with terrible men. And one day, one of them finally snaps. She kills her husband with his own belt by strangling him while their kids are sleeping in the next room. And the other 3 women help her cut up the body and dispose of it and avoid detection from the police. We know the crime, we know the culprit, but this is a feminist novel that asks for our sympathy. The police are on their tail, as are the Yakuza, and this is a book that explores the criminal underworld of Tokyo in a really, really visceral way. Obvious trigger warnings, this book is full of death and dismemberment, but also domestic abuse, so tread carefully. I am a huge fan of Emily St. John Mandel, but I put off reading The Glass Hotel for a little while because when you read the blurb, it sounds horribly boring. And I should have had faith in her because it really, really isn't. It's exquisitely well written. This is what I guess you could call a literary thriller. It's a book with multiple protagonists that moves through time. We begin with a teenager called Paul who makes a lot of mistakes when it comes to drugs and generally being a bad kid. Eventually he ends up working at a hotel in the northern reaches of Vancouver Island in an area called Cayette. He works there with his half-sister. And the first mystery is that some really, really threatening graffiti appears on a wall. The graffiti is very obviously targeting someone specific, but we don't know who, and Paul is immediately blamed for it and fired. And from there, we follow his sister throughout most of the novel. Paul's sister essentially ends up running away with the guy who owns the hotel, who is a New York City financier. She moves to New York with him and she suddenly has a really privileged life working as his arm candy. But as the blurb gives away, her husband, his entire business isn't real. It's a Ponzi scheme. So this is a thriller that doesn't focus on murder. It doesn't focus on gritty crimes, but more financial crimes, lies and schemes. People getting away with or failing to get away with crimes that often don't get explored in literature. However, again, as the blurb gives away, our protagonist, Vincent, which is an unusual name for a woman and that comes up a few times, she ends up falling off a boat. She vanishes. The fact that the blurb gives that away makes you wonder, when will this happen? How will this happen? Did she kill herself? Did she actually fall? Did she disappear in some other way? Was she killed? Lots and lots of questions, and we wonder, as we read the book, how we're going to get there. Because the blurb really gives away everything. And what you're left wondering is, how, when, and why? There's a lot of things going on here that you're desperate to understand, find out, and piece together. This is a different kind of thriller, because it doesn't involve murder. Or the police. And I really appreciate that. The Maid is a novel that treads that line between cozy murder mystery and more gritty thriller. It's another Canadian novel that follows the titular maid who works at a really fancy hotel. She is very, very autistic coded. I don't think the author is autistic, so representation isn't great in this. And I'd actually be really interested to know what other people think when it comes to that. But she's an incredibly likable and charming protagonist. She doesn't understand the world around her, and so when she walks into the hotel suite of a regular guest and he's dead on the bed and she gets wrapped up in the crime, you feel really sorry for her because she is very, very overwhelmed by all of this. She used to live with her grandmother, who recently died, and now she's alone. She's been taken advantage of by men in the past, and now she's up against a police detective who has absolutely no sympathy for her, and starts to think that maybe Molly did it. Now, as I said, when it comes to the neurodiverse representation in this novel, I'm not entirely sold on it. It's really weird that autism is never mentioned in the novel, and that all the other characters are completely neurotypical and have never heard of people being neurodiverse, never heard of autism, and just find Molly to be a complete freak. That doesn't feel very realistic. People are surprisingly sympathetic towards autism, ADHD, and other neurodiversities. It's pretty normal these days. So it feels like it's set in some alternate universe where Molly is the only autistic person in the world. In spite of that, it's a really, really gripping thriller, because this murder is not the only thing at play here. The hotel has a lot of secrets, especially amongst the workers there. There are other crimes going on here. There is other stuff. And as those crimes and the murder start to overlap, and suspects start to blur, it's really, really interesting. While I don't love the neurodiverse representation here, I do love the way the crime is structured and how things are revealed and laid out and pieced together. It's a real page-turner. A Certain Hunger by Chelsea G. Summers is a very different kind of thriller. This is a book where you are following the antagonist. It's a little bit like Promising Young Woman, which is a great film if you haven't seen it. Our protagonist is a woman who loves killing men, and she selects little bits of them to eat after she's done killing them. She's also a food writer, a food critic, a restaurant critic, and she's known for it. She's written multiple books on it. She writes a column for a magazine. She's really well respected. And that means that the book is written with brilliant wit. The wit of a genuinely talented columnist and author. You are in her head, you are reading her words, and these words are actually being written from a prison cell, because she's been put away for this. She was caught, and we follow her life story as she serially kills men after being in a relationship with them, or after using them to get a job or some leg up in life. It's really satisfying in a very guilty kind of a way. It's probably the most fun thriller on this list. Finally, we come to the newest book at the time of recording, which is Death of a Bookseller by Alice Slater. I've done a full video on this that you can go check out. This is a kind of almost but not quite metatextual thriller that is about crime, about thrillers. We have two protagonists. They both work at a bookshop in East London. One of them is an alternative goth punk girl who's obsessed with true crime podcasts. The other is a preppy, arrogant young woman who hates all of that stuff. But Roach, the dark, edgy girl, sees something dark in Laura and becomes absolutely obsessed with her, sure that the two of them should be friends in spite of their differences, and starts getting a little bit too close, too stalkery, and things get really weird. And we do learn a little bit later on that Laura has had a rough life, and her reasons for hating the concept of true crime books, true crime podcasts, and that huge trend that we're all following right now, it's all justified, and it's dark. We follow both of these women, and we also get inklings early in the story that Laura is not long for this world. We can pretty confidently assume that the bookseller who dies in the title is Laura. Does Roach kill her? It certainly feels like she could. She's stalkery, she's weird, and she's obsessed with murder, so that makes sense, but that's way too obvious, so you've got to read on and find out. That was just a small selection of awesome thrillers that I've read recently and really enjoyed. Some of them have overlaps with cozy murder mysteries, some overlap with horror, but they are all thrillers in one way or another. And there are loads more that I've read that you can check out on the website. Also, feel free to offer up your suggestions. I'm on a bit of a thriller binge at the moment, and I want to read more genuinely good ones that don't have girl in their title, preferably. So let me know, and subscribe for books.